busy you are with everybody locked down.
Yeah, I haven't had a minute to myself. I got to go on an Instagram live too in like an hour.
Wow. For most of us golf pros that are like the guys on the range, like you still give live lessons, but most of us were having to adapt and you were already there.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I think just luckily I was kind of a few years ahead of this whole scenario. So as much as everyone's struggling, I seem to be thriving off it, which obviously I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. I've learned a lot from you, and the goal today was just kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the things I've learned from you and following you guys, and bring information to some of the better players, because I feel like your niche is the younger guy, the guy that's on social media, that's using apps. I'm sure you still teach some older guys, or are you finding yourself mainly younger?
I would say maybe 15 to 20% of my lessons are like guys over 45, 50.
Okay.
But yeah, very few. Maybe one in every six or seven people I'm coaching. For the most part, it's younger, more talented guys that are on tour or kind of on the mini tours.
For sure. I follow you on Instagram, so there are almost 80,000 other people. So your social media platforms are exploding. They have been. You kind of set that trend for a lot of instructors, and it's nice to learn. As you know, and I'm sure you do all the time, I know you're very data driven, so there's not too much leeway there. And for instructors like me, it's awesome to find a teacher that is kind of changing the way that we learn. Because I grew up in the '90s with David Ledbetter, and not to say that system was wrong, but the way I grew up was restrict with the lower body, keep the bend in the legs, all this kind of teaching, which now you're challenging based on science and data.
Yeah, first of all, I unfortunately grew up through the same way. I have a herniated disc in my lower back, in my L5S1 of my spine, because of restricting lower body work from when I was younger. So unfortunately, that took me out for a long time. But yeah, it's very data driven. I think the thing that I pride myself on a lot is anything I post on social media cannot be argued through opinion.
Okay.
It's very clearly mathematical. I like things that are proven. I'm a math and science guy. I have a math major. So for me, it's like I see numbers and I get excited. Other people, I don't teach things for aesthetics. Honestly, I would say that a lot of the people that come to me online already kind of have an idea what they're going to get, just because they know kind of where my preferences are with the golf swing. And my preferences are preferences, but at the same time, my philosophy is much more, let's just get your swing to work. And whatever way it needs to move to work is fine. Obviously, there are some ways that are more efficient than others, which is where my preference kind of falls. But, some people can't do the things that I teach, which is why you have to work around it. And I think any good coach prides themselves on the ability to adapt to the person in front of them, because everyone's so unique. You can't take everybody and fit them into this model. I know there's a lot of method coaches out there, and certainly, that was the case more in the '90s. Everybody had their own way of going about it, and it was like, this is the only way to do it. I really don't think my preferences are the only way to do it. I just think they're my preferences because I found them to be very efficient. I think that's kind of what separates the coaches now from the coaches of 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. You look at those guys 20 years ago, and it was, this is the system. It was more like, how does the swing look compared to how does it function? You look at the Hall of Fame, there's guys that have the club inside, there's guys that take the club outside, but at the end of the day, they get it done. And those are obviously very skilled players, but we don't need to get everybody to fit this exact method. I'm not a method teacher. I believe there's a lot of ways to get it done, as long as certain, like you say, and where I've got it from you, as long as matchups happen. And that's one thing that you've opened my eyes to, which I've been on Course Kings for 2 years, which is a site you are on with other great minds in the game, Jeff Smith, and countless others. And I think a lot of instructors are on that site learning. Obviously, there's some students too, but it's kind of nice that have a younger generation that's challenging some of the thoughts in the past. Do you feel, in my opinion, you're known mainly for matchups, talking about body tilts, which a lot of people don't understand. Yeah. Can you explain to the better player that grew up in the '90s? Because a lot of us now that are at a club like I'm at, a lot of the teacher guys that I work with that are better are going to be 25 to 35. They grew up in that same time period. When I'm telling them, to let that trail leg extend and to let go of that mentality, or that it's okay to lift your lead foot a little bit in your backswing, that's different for them. I mean, where does that come from? How did you come across, right, we got to get back to these body tilts? Was it your injury?
To some degree, yeah. I had to overhaul my entire golf swing. When I tore my when I got the hernia in my back, I was a +2 handicap, so I was never like good enough to make it or anything. But I was obviously a very high level player, and I quickly fell into like a 6-7 handicap in 1 year because I couldn't support the movements that my body was doing because it was too painful.
Yeah.
And so, in learning how to overhaul my golf swing to take stress off my body as much as possible, I learned the importance of the tilting pattern because, the way I look at tilts, and I'll try to explain this like a simple way as possible because it is a very complex subject, obviously, is, everybody thinks of rotation as like a rotary component, and obviously the rotation is a huge part of it. But if I tilt my body in a certain method, no matter where I'm kind of going with it, I'm going to restrict or impede my body from being able to create the rotation that I'm trying to get to. So when I try to explain to people like why tilts are important, it's not that tilts are the only thing important for rotation. It's that without the proper tilts, you're going to restrict your body from being able to create the rotation. So it's like an added component to the turn that you need to have, or you're going to make it significantly harder to be able to do that. And I mean, just to kind of, I can literally stand here. I'm kind of holding stuff with a knife board here, but if I hold a knife up, right, like, you're going to think of the knife like rotation like this. But if I stand here and I start to push my lower body really hard towards the target, my upper body is going to start to fall back. Right? It's pretty common sense because you're going to try to keep yourself balanced. You can't get your whole body flying forward. You're going to land onto the target. I mean, it doesn't work. So when your lower body starts to shove forward, right, we always used to hear, bump the hips, keep the back closed, all these things. Well, if I start to tilt the upper body forward, my right shoulder for me as a righty is going to start to fall back. There's no way I can turn if my pressure and my weight is starting to fall away from the target. I just can't turn anymore. So, the importance of the tilting is really to allow the body to be able to turn correctly. At the end of the day, if you don't have the tilts, it's not to say you won't be able to turn. It's to say you're making it so much harder on yourself. Why would you want to go through more work when you can simplify it? And that's kind of where I started finding the importance of like the shoulder plane and the hips and the pelvis and all that.
It is pretty, and I don't know if have you read that book that Brandel Chambly wrote? Did you read that book?
I haven't.
All right. I don't know if you're familiar. It's very similar to what he looked at guys in the past, like Sam Snead and Jack Nicklaus, and how they extended that rear leg and allowed that to work and kind of did the same thing you did. He's like, we can learn from legends. Why are we teaching the way we did in the 90s and early 2000s? It's very similar. You guys are on the same page.
I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of examples you can find in history of matchups that work. And I mean, so let's talk about Jack Nicklaus's golf swing. Jack Nicklaus has a swing that I would never teach the everyday golfer because they can't support that. I talk a lot about the idea of like skill versus technique. To me, a golfer who's really skilled can overcome technique deficiencies. Yeah. That's kind of where I see Jack falls in. Like, Jack doesn't have the best technical golf swing if we're talking about a repeatable pattern, but he was so damn skilled he can overcome that. I mean, that's just the reality of it, right? And so he had really steep shaft coming down, really upright hands at the top, and he used to tilt like a madman away from the target, and he would hit the ball super high, right? Doesn't deliver a ton of shaft lean, has a lot of loft at the bottom, and he hits it very, very high. Well, I see that pattern all day on my lesson tee. I mean, I literally see a carbon copy of Jack Nicklaus's golf swing every single day on my lesson tee, but these people can't break 90. So clearly, it's not the question of saying like Jack has a swing you want to emulate. No, I see people emulating that swing. They can't do it. They can't hit the ball well. They don't have the skill to support that pattern. So in my opinion, there's a lot you can learn from the matchups that made that work. But at the end of the day, it's not that you should be teaching those models. It's more about understanding what made Jack good. Like, what made Jack good was understanding that when the hands are very tall at the top, it's going to require some sort of movement with the body to match it. And what I see a lot with like a 20 handicap golfer is that the arms are super tall, but then that golfer rotates like crazy. The hands end up way too far in front of them, and then their path gets super out to in, and they're slicing it. And then they say, well, why am I hitting these huge slices? Well, it's because your body's not adapting the same way Jack Nicklaus's body adapted in the downswing. Right there is a prime example of something you can learn that Jack did that made his swing work. Right. So when you look at these legends in the old school kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, there's a lot of things they did that made their swings work, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should teach them. Just understand why they work. And I think that's where a lot of these young coaches are starting to learn to look back into those things and figure them out,
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that you and I both believe in is that face is king. The club face, I mean, path is obviously very important, but if you just work on path and your face isn't there, it's not going to help you at all, and it's going to make it worse. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the lesson that I would say 70–80% of us give all the time is the guy that's hitting the slice, the weak slice, face is open, he's over the top. So how I would attack that based on, you know, learning from guys like yourself is we got to get the face under control first. But let's say you do that. Do you attack that then in the backswing? And I know that you do because you believe a good backswing sets up that downswing. But now let's say that same golfer's got the club face in a better position. It's not so open, and now he's hitting pulls to the left.
Yeah.
Thought process is, all right, now I'm missing it this way. He doesn't understand, I think, the evolution of how his golf swing is going to change. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would talk about that. First of all, when he starts pulling the ball, he's already going to gain probably 10, 15, 20 yards. So
Yeah.
right off the bat, mentally, he probably won't be as discouraged, even if he's missing, because he's missing it with an added club or two of distance. So right there's already some benefits that this person's starting to see.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that I try to clarify for every student who comes and sees me is before we even work on the club face, I'm going to give them the awareness of what to expect once they start to work on it. Because I think that an area where I think a lot of coaches can improve is not necessarily just like a cliche thing like saying communication is important. It's more about like give them the awareness of what to expect beforehand. Because if you do that, that golfer is going to see that and they're not going to get so discouraged anymore. You know, you see like, okay, so let's say there's a golfer with the face open and that golfer is actually hitting pulls because they're early releasing the crap out of the hands. The face closes too much and, you know, they're missing it left for the right-handed player, but they're missing it left because the face is open. That's a mind to understand, right? And sorry for the language, but you know, it's yeah. So like if you can give that person the breakdown and the understanding of how the shaft movement influences the club face, and then you show them on camera with some video feedback what's going on, you know, once they make that adjustment, it really doesn't matter if they're pulling the ball because they're going to have expected that before. You know, there's nothing worse, in my opinion, for a player than standing on the range and working on something your coach is telling you and then seeing a ball flight that you weren't expecting, because then you start to worry if that's the right thing you're doing. But if it's like your coach told you beforehand, you're going to hit a pull when you close the face because the path is causing the pull and your face matches the path and it's going in that direction and now you're pulling it. Well, as soon as that golfer closes the face and they hit the pull, they're going to be like, all right, I expected this. It's not going to bother me at all, you know? And then you go through the evolution of the next steps. So I think communication in that regard is very important, just giving the student the awareness of what to expect beforehand so that when they do see that, they'll understand the evolution from A to Z. And so when they're at that kind of midpoint, they're not going to start freaking out about it.
Yep. And I think what you do great, and you and I have talked about this, and you did this with me and when we worked, is you lay out that progression. You're like, you know, if your club face is closed, and this winter when you and I were talking, I was hitting it over hook. I was drawing too much. You're like, a win right now for you, because you're going to hit a draw, is to hit some blocks. It's okay. Hit some blocks, and then we can clean that up. But I think a lot of players, regardless of skill level, sometimes, you know, we want it now and we don't understand, all right, we're going to, you know, we're not taking a step back. We're still going forward, but this is going to be the process to get there.
Yeah, I think that's where the whole communication comes in because, you know, a lot of times you'll be working with a player and let's say a player has a huge problem in their golf swing that's very obvious, right? Now, that problem, unfortunately, is almost never just an isolated problem in itself. It's going to attack 7 different things in the golf swing at the same time, right? So everything is connected. So if I just move my chest, I'm moving the shoulder, the arm, the hands, everything's going. So because so many variables are affected at the same time because of one issue, you might see 7 problems, but I guess the experienced eye is where you figure out where does the problem start, what is creating that problem, and then what are the subsequent chain reaction of events that are taking place that problem is affecting. Yeah. And so if you have problem A, but then there's a compensation involved in that problem, well, the swing might actually work because the compensation is a Band-Aid that's offsetting the problem, right?
Yep.
But what happens if you get rid of the problem, but then that compensation still exists? Well, now the system breaks down, right? Because now the formula doesn't work to the same successful number that it had before. So I think giving the student the awareness of saying, look, we got rid of the reason all these things you do in the downswing exist, that's good because we got rid of the main reason why that happened. The downswing still exists. So you might not hit it great for a very small period of time until we start to figure out how to get rid of those pieces. And there's no longer a necessity to have those pieces anymore because the problem's gone. So you can get rid of them. And I think understanding how that whole cycle of events works in a player's swing because everything is connected, is hugely important for the process of just the player's dedication and motivation to continue improving without freaking out or, second guessing what they're doing.
Yeah, and then I think a lot of guys they're not patient. Like they're making that change and they don't understand that it's going to take time to make that first change. I mean, you got to groove that, you got to hit balls, and a lot of guys are not patient. They want it now, and they don't understand that they can't just feel it once or twice and hit at full speed. Where I feel speed's the enemy. And I think sometimes rehearsing it slow. How do you feel on that? Like, I mean, when a guy's doing, and I ask some other teachers this too, block practice, when you're making a swing change and you work with a lot of high level guys on the Corn Ferry tour, on the Champions Tour, when they're making a change, can you talk about how they go about the change?
Yeah. So I think there's a fine line regarding speed when you're working on things, because I think that swinging too fast is super detrimental, because the faster your body moves, the less spatial awareness you have around you. So if I move my arm super slowly, I can feel where this arm is in space at all times. But if I start to flail my arm all around, there's no way I can pinpoint where my hand was throughout that sequence of events. It just doesn't happen, right? So as speed increases, spatial awareness typically goes down. It's hard for you to be able to feel the difference of what you're doing. But then I think there's also a point where you start swinging too slow, that the rhythm and the sequence and the forces you're actually going to apply to the club are no longer existent, right? Like if I swing my arm really fast and I'm moving this thing, well, I'm going to move it a certain way. But if I start to move my arm so slow, I am no longer applying the force to this club or this knife or whatever the same way I would. So there is a fine line of swinging too slow as well. I think the ideal range is in like that 40 to 80% range. So you start at like that 40% and then you slowly build your way up. So just for spatial awareness reasons, to be able to actually feel what you're doing differently, so your brain can process, okay, this is what I used to do and this is what I'm trying to do. Certainly slowing things down helps. Now, obviously everybody is very unique, so change is subjective. I can't say that everybody needs to do that. I mean, Stephen Ames and I have been working for a year. When I worked with him, it took 2 hours on the driving range to make some changes, and he got it like this. But then I have a guy like Dylan Wu on the Corn Ferry, who's been working on his shaft alignment at the top of the backswing, and it's 9 months he's working on it, and he still can't get it. And he does a ton of slow motion drills on the range and block practice and all these things. So I think it's important to also understand that, just because Joe in the corner of the range got it in an hour does not mean that you should get that same change in an hour. You might get it in 5 minutes, you might get it in 3 months. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. We can't control that. That is completely out of our control of how fast the player improves. But as long as they commit to that process and they understand that speed sometimes is your enemy when you're swinging really, really fast. I try to tell people the only time you should be swinging fast when you're making a change is if you are trying to work on speed. At the end of the day, that's obviously your goal. So you want to be swinging fast. If you're working on other things, there's no penalties to slowing it down. I mean, what's the difference if I hit my 9-iron 130 yards instead of 150 when I'm working on something? It's not like I'm on the course. And when you're on the course, you're going to swing faster. You have adrenaline. You're going to tense up. Everybody's club head speed increases on the golf course. That's just the reality of it. So there's no penalties to slowing things down on the range. You're not going to swing at that speed as soon as you get to the course anyway. So just understand that,
Yeah, for sure. And I think that everybody is individual and find what works for you and that speed based on unique factors like yourself. I mean, you think of Nick Price, his swing was very, very fast. And you think of somebody like Freddie Couples, it's loosey-goosey, and it's matching up kind of how you're learning to your swing. Certain guys walk fast, talk fast, some are slow. And I think being individual is huge. You got to keep that in you, especially when you're making a change.
Yeah, I think that, if we're talking, let's say like tour players or even anybody in general, we cannot as a coach comment on feel, because feel is way too subjective. So you might have a guy who looks like he's swinging really slow, but in his mind, he might be swinging out of his shoes and feel very fast. And vice versa. You might have a guy who's swinging very fast who actually doesn't feel like he's swinging that fast at the ball, and it's very controlled. And so having a conversation with your players to understand how their feel translates into their speed is very, very important for you to be able to figure out what speed should this player be practicing things at. Because if a guy's going to come to you and he's swinging super fast and he's like, well, I don't really feel like I'm swinging that fast, there's not necessarily a need to have to slow them down just because they're swinging fast. We shouldn't automatically equate the reality of how fast the player is swinging to, this person needs to swing slower to learn. No, it's how fast does he feel like he's going. That's where you should slow things down, because if he feels like he's swinging slow, it doesn't matter what his actual speed is. he will still be able to apply those changes. So understanding how feel translates to every specific individual is very, very important.
Yeah, no, because everybody is an individual, right? And we don't know what they're feeling per se. If you don't mind, I'm gearing this, and most players that are going to watch this are the better younger guys. All right. So these kind of guys right now know, because now the trend has switched in golf, and we're talking about tilts. A lot of those guys don't have that going. So, and I know you've talked at length sometimes about Jason Day, right? And his back issues. So let me ask you a question. It's two questions. What's a swing on tour that you like right now a lot that people can maybe model? And then how would somebody go about starting to feel like they're adding some of that tilt, feeling like the pressure is going into that without getting off the ball too much? Like, how would they start incorporating tilts?
So when I look at tilts, I look at two things: the bending from your rib cage for the upper body, and I look at the changes in the knee flex with the lower body. Because if my front knee starts to go down, that's going to lower my hip, because the hip joint is on the same line as where the the whole femur and the leg is as a whole, right? So if my knee starts to gain flex, my left hip, for me as a right-handed player, is going to start to lower anyways. That's also going to lower my left shoulder at the same time. I mean, if I just stand tall and I just start to gain bend on this side, my whole body's going to start to go down there. So the fear that I think a lot of people come with when it comes to knee flex changes is that they overdo extreme tilts without creating the turn, and they're just doing this. And then they're like, well, now I'm leaning towards the target a lot. That clearly doesn't work. So then you start to say, okay, why don't you match those tilts with get the chest feeling like it's pointing away from the target while you're doing that, because you're not going to lean this way. You're going to have to turn to get the chest there. And at the same time, feel like your pressure is still very much into your right leg. Because if you're just going to lean and you're not going to worry about where your weight distribution is on the floor, I mean, yeah, it's going to fall into your left toes for the right-handed player really quick. So you can't just think of tilts as just tilts themselves. You have to very much be aware of where the weight distribution is through the ground, where your pressure movement is going, and look at where the upper body is going. I mean, if your chest tilts this way, my chest is pointing towards the target. I don't want that. I want to create a lot of turn to get the chest away from the ball, and that'll allow my whole sequence to actually stay into my right leg a little bit. Because really the big issue I see with players who tilt and fear it is that they lean forward and their weight stays on the front leg. And then it's like they either stay there and then back up on the downswing, which is obviously a problem, or what ends up happening is, you know, they kind of lean this way and then they never get off that front leg, and their pressure doesn't move very efficiently. So understanding your pressure distribution through the ground is very, very important with that. You'll kind of have to match both of them together. If we're talking about a swing on tour that I like,
I know it's tough.
Honestly, not necessarily. There's a lot. To be fair, I don't like most swings on tour. That's kind of the problem. Is that I think as a coach, when you get so accustomed to analyzing golf swings, I tend to see more issues than things that I like pretty quick. Yeah. So I'll look at guys on tour and like immediately I'll say, okay, this guy, this sucks. This guy, this sucks. This guy can do this better and whatever. I mean, it's so cliche to say, but I really like Rory's golf swing for the everyday golfer. And the reason I'm going to say that is because the everyday golfer struggles with the path too strong from outside in. Yep. The everyday golfer doesn't shallow the club very well. They're very steep on the ball. So using Rory as a visual could really help those golfers kind of neutralize things a little bit, because Rory has the arm structure very deep and behind him, which allows him to swing more from the inside. Rory's shaft angle is very, very shallow coming down. Again, very strong from the inside. If anything, Rory's problem is actually the opposite of most golfers. His path is too strong from the inside. And what makes him a really good driver of the ball makes him a really bad wedge player. And I talk about this a lot, which is that you'll typically see those two kind of extremes. You know, you'll see a guy like Luke Donald, who's the best wedge player on tour, but he is really bad off the tee. I mean, he's short, he's crooked, his strokes gain, he's in the bottom 10% on tour. Not a good long drive player, but his short game is world class. Well, then the question then becomes, okay, so why is Rory such a good driver of the ball and really a below average wedge player? It kind of falls in the same thing. You know, ball position plays a huge role on your path, right? So if we're looking at ball position, the further up the ball gets in the stance, you hit up more up on the ball, but you're going to swing more outside in. Now, for your everyday golfer who's already cutting across the ball, that ball position being forward is going to make their slice even worse. So they struggle to control the driver a lot. Not only that, obviously, the straighter lofted face makes it harder to keep it straight too. So when the ball position moves back on their wedge, you know, they can hit the ball higher. The loft is going to make it curve less, but also the ball being back makes them swing a little more from the inside than what they're usually doing. So it actually offsets some of their path issues. But then you see a guy like Rory, the ball position's being up, he draws the ball. That ball position actually helps his driver straighten it out quite a bit because he hits really up on the ball and he hits really out to in relative to the rest of his swing with his driver. But then he puts the ball position back in his stance and he's so shallow and from the inside that he actually gets too inside out with the wedges and he tends to block them quite a bit. So his miss with his wedge is kind of short right and spinny because he's too strong from the inside. So if we're looking at where the regular high handicap golfer can emulate, I would always say look at Rory's golf swing because having the arms a little more behind you, having the club a little more from the inside, that can help 90% of people who are hitting those slices. So I would say Rory's golf swing, to be honest, would be my answer.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, his depth on his backswing's great, and his rotate, how good he can rotate through the ball. But a key point you made, I mean, you look at tour players, you look at a guy like Tiger Woods. Now, obviously, he doesn't drive the ball well at all, especially under pressure. He's very spinny, but yet he's the best iron player of all time. So you never see a guy that's just great all the way through the bag. Same with Phil. Phil is very steep. His body kind of stops rotating. He's not good with the drive. But he's
a great wedge player.
Exactly. I mean, there's no guy inside of 100 yards that I want hitting his shot other than Phil. So, I mean, the take home is, as a good player or as any player, find out where your weakness is, maybe identify that, find out where you're good, but just also having an understanding that you can't be awesome in every phase of the game. That's our goal, but it's not going to happen.
In my experience of working with tour players, you're good if you're going to have a very big deficiency in one area of your game. And really, you can look at the game in 4 areas, right? There's driving, there's iron play, there's around the green, and there's putting. So if you're going to have a deficiency in one of those areas, the rest of the 3 components have to be good enough to overcome that deficiency. And you'll see that a lot with guys on tour. You know, the really, really good iron players and drivers of the ball maybe don't have the best short games, but they don't need to have the best short games. They hit more than enough greens. If their short game is average, they're going to still compete in a lot of events. If you're not going to be a good driver of the ball, you literally have to be one of the best wedge players in the world, like Luke Donald. And even then, he can't even sustain that now. He's still struggling on tour. So, you know, I would say that obviously a balance is very, very good. But if you're going to have a weakness, the other 3 areas have to be so good that they overcome that deficiency. If they're not to that level, you're going to end up struggling. So you're really going to have to improve that weakness at some point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know you're a busy guy, and you got another podcast. I think you said you're going on in a little bit, Instagram Live. So I don't want to take up all your time today, and I really appreciate you sitting down with Shauheen. It means a lot.
My pleasure, dude, and I hope everybody enjoys the knowledge we're dropping here.
Thanks. I appreciate it, man. Stay safe, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right, dude.